So in terms of success, just going back to the point I made earlier about in-sessionals sometimes being, EAP centres sometimes being rather entrepreneurial in outlook. Sometimes they're very answerable to things like student recruitment and so on. And in-sessional success often defies measurability. It's very hard to spot a correlation between engagement with the process and student outcomes. And what for one student might be success, for example, a distinction in a piece of work, for another student, it might simply be passing. And actually kind of drawing a line between the work we do and the student outcome is very tricky, even if it's potentially something that management would like to see. I see success more in terms of our development of our role within the institution, enculturating a belief in the value of our work, getting disciplinary lecturers to support and align with the work we're trying to do. However, and I think this is a bit of an elephant in the room, really. Very often, if an in-sessional is situated as extracurricular, there's not going to be, or there's unlikely to be, any assessed work. Students may not have to produce any writing, for example. And it can be, as one of our interviewees quite insightfully put it, it can be like teaching people how to learn to drive without getting them in the car. So that there's a sense that it can be about writing rather than doing writing. So success there is, again, just very hard to measure. Very often we rely on student feedback to report our success. But then if this is at the end of a course, maybe the value of the work or the skills they've developed in that course can only come through later on. They might not have a handle on it at that moment. It may only sort of follow as they progress in their degrees. So overall, just speaking, sort of summing up about the context, we see in-sessional as something of an outlier. We see it as very hard to evaluate. We see it as being very often not visible, and it may be resource heavy to do well. Yet, despite all these potential concerns, worries, or maybe negatives, we would argue that it's absolutely essential to a high quality student experience and essential to the work of an EAP centre, for that matter. So I'll now hand back to Neil, who's going to particularly focus on thoughts about practitioner identities in sessionals.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, so yeah, I think when we were preparing for this, I think we also wanted to speak to kind of bits of the book that so although we wrote it together, we did kind of take the lead on different chapters, and I think we wanted to speak a little bit to bits that were, particularly, bits that we had kind of taken the lead on, I think, in this presentation today. And for the purpose of doing that, I reread some of the chapters, which haven't really done since the book came out, and it's just quite a scary thing to do, reading back over your own writing, isn't it? I'm not sure if it's great, but actually it was quite interesting to go back over it and see what kind of really popped out at me, or things that I thought were very kind of key themes that kind of came out of the book, and of particularly of the interviews that we did, and the fact that we spoke to people in situ. So some of the things that I found really interesting, and which I think is quite nice to put out there today, and also in terms of the in-sessional SIG as kind of areas to think about when it comes to in-sessional, and what is specific about in-sessional as well. There are lots of things connected to pedagogy and the identity and the positioning, the roles and the attributes of working in this area. And part of that is about the pedagogy and the teaching, and a question of whether teaching on in-sessional is a bit different to teaching in other areas of EAP because of the need for collaborating with others and all the logistical things as well, but also in terms of knowledge and how you're working at the sort of cutting edge of sort of language and content, if you like, because you're working with students as they do their courses. Some of the things that I noted as I was rereading it that jumped out for me was this idea. I think someone talked about this idea of distilling knowledge, and then I think one of the other quotes that we used in the book from one of the interviews was this idea of when you're working as an in-sessional teacher, you're working with students to kind of mediate their process of understanding what they have to do and how they develop their academic literacy within their particular discipline. And sort of describing the very rewarding nature of in-sessional, where it can be that you're working with a student and it's a sort of between you as you're discussing their writing or whatever, a kind of a light bulb goes on and it kind of helps them to understand where they are. So it implies a different role for a teacher. And we did discuss in the book something about that, is that particular to in-sessional compared to other courses where perhaps because you're not the kind of the main teacher, if you like, of the subject, but you're going in and working with those teachers, that you have more of a sort of facilitator role or a meddler role, to use the McWilliam term about meddler in the middle. And also, what's your role in terms of learning? And are you kind of serving as a sort of part of the learning process in terms of this distilling of knowledge? So I think that's a very interesting area to think about. And, hopefully in the book, we just raised some of those points, which I think would be really interesting ones to take up and have a look at. The other thing is thinking about the identity of practitioners working in this area as well, and what the impact is on us when we work in this area. I've just put there a few of the sort of things related to identity that came out of the interviews that we mentioned in the book and discuss in the book. So, for example, this idea of where do you stand? I just realized that I just said you're not the main teacher. And as soon as I said it, I thought, yeah, I shouldn't really say that, should I? But I mean, it's kind of, this idea of where are you positioned with the lecturer, with your, it's how does that work? Are you a core part of the learning? I just taught some students on a master's in teaching English to speakers of other languages this morning, and their main lecturer came in to kind of just give a kind of social update in the middle of my session, but I'm sort of included in that as part of their program. But there's lots of different contexts in the way that people work, and it's not like that for everything I teach. So that does depend. And I think one of the phrases I thought was very interesting was one of our interviewees described it as being like a peripheral being. So you can feel that you're, where is your positioning? Are you in the center of learning, or are you sort of have a sort of more peripheral role? In terms of that, dealing with lecturers, for example, again, my teaching this morning, there was a session all about feedback, and I did kind of briefly for feedback to the lecturer about the students and their feedback and their feelings about their feedback that they had just received, because the session was timed to fit in with that. So in some ways, you can be a bit of a go-between, and a go-between between lecturer and students. You can also be a go-between between different lecturers on different programs you work on, because you create kind of connections across the university. I've often had the case to say to people, oh, actually you should talk to this person in education because they're doing this, or, you can create these kind of links from one department to another as well. It's another possible interpretation of go-between. One of the descriptions of someone's practice as well is a bit different. Was someone described themselves as being a fluffy signpost, which I think is a great image, but it's this idea of being a very approachable member of teaching staff in a university, and also somebody who can point students in the right direction if they have questions related to language or related to their academic development. Like because of where we work in the kind of third space of the university as well, we're part of that. We know the other people who operate in that area, but we also know their courses and what students typically need, and we have this understanding. So this idea that we're an approachable person who can point people in the right direction is what that means. One of the points about how is it a rewarding area of practice to work in or not, is this idea, somebody commented that working in in-sessional more than in other areas of the AP made them feel like a fully fledged academic or a fully fledged member of the university teaching staff. as opposed to other courses where if you're working on pathway courses like foundation, or if you're working on kind of preparatory courses, I should say, you maybe don't feel like you're part of the main learning quite the same way as you do within sessional. You get to go to sessions, you get to attend meetings, you sometimes get invited to student staff liaison committees in different departments and things like that. I spoke at the PG Law's SSLC yesterday, for example. So you know, you can kind of start to become part of the sort of wider academic community within the university. And how do you get your courses going, and what's the best way to approach that? And we do talk in the book a little bit about the idea of the sort of, you know, the going beyond just being a teacher, but also setting up courses and being involved in the curriculum design and operating in collaboration with departments. And someone talked about how it's important to be a nuisance to kind of get things done, to get yourself onto committees within the university in order that you can get visibility for what you do, you can get buy-in for what you're trying to do with your courses. So there's lots of really, really interesting things about identity, I think, to unpack within Sessional. So that was one of the things that we really wanted to highlight, and I think maybe suggest as an area where, you know, further kind of research into in Sessional as a specific area of practice would be really interesting. The other thing that we sort of finished the book on a note was a sort of idea of leading out into kind of where in Sessional could be going. So this is the sort of into the sunset moment, I suppose, and it is the penultimate slide, so that, you know, it does relate to that. But in terms of beyond EAP, where does in Sessional take you beyond just being an in Sessional EAP person? So on that can also be looked at a number of levels. As I just mentioned, people often, pretty much everybody we spoke to talked about how rewarding, challenging, rewarding area of practice in Sessional is. But there are kind of great personal development things from that. So some of the attributes you learn from setting up courses are very important sort of transferable skills in terms of educational management as well, about kind of wider pedagogical understandings in terms of HE pedagogy as well. So there's lots of different things there that kind of relate to the sort of personal development. You know, working on in Sessional can feed in if you're applying for things like fellowship of HEA or for the Barlead Fellowship Scheme or something like that, because you get to do things that really tie in with those ideas. You get to expand your own skill base, if you like, and your own experience, and you gain the kind of competence of being a contributor to pedagogy within a university, I think, particularly within Sessional. In terms of scholarship and research as well, I think one of the things that came out in the book is this idea, and Tim and I have talked about this before in other conferences, this idea of that because you're in situ, you're where the learning is taking place during the course that students are taking. It's a kind of unique vantage point, and also the role is kind of a very interesting role. So, you know, there's I think a lot of scope for research and scholarship related to that idea of where we sit with students and what we can see from working very closely with lecturers and with students and being in the midst of the learning as well. Another thing just to say about in Sessional is that we also noted a number of occasions where people have kind of gone beyond their remit. So I'm trying to think of examples of that. One thing would be at Bristol with the Faculty of Engineering, I set up some joint assessment on summative assessment on master's courses with them, with co-written marking criteria and kind of co-marked research projects, and then for another course for some group presentations. Successful in lots of ways, but always interesting again to kind of examine whether it's actually worked in a way, like, you know, or what was our positioning? Was our positioning the ideal positioning of that? And I'm hoping to talk about that at the PIM coming up at King's, because I think that was a sort of an interesting experience. But getting involved in assessment with people, that's kind of going beyond your original remit. Things like HEA assessing and mentoring across the university, which is not maybe a direct result of working in Sessional, but it can kind of relate to that. And both Tim and I do that in our institutions. And I recently had someone observe me, and then I observed them on the course that we're both teaching into in an engineering course recently. So as an example of that, so I kind of became this person's mentor because we were working together, and that's how that came about. So again, that's kind of stretching It's like sort of brand stretching of in sessional EAP, I think.